Some things happen without explanation. Some experiences haunt people for a lifetime. This is where I tell those mysteries. And remember, not everything can be explained. Story. The real witch of Pendle still lives in the forest. Don't look for her. There's a story that you won't read in history books. It's a truth that you only hear in my village. The Pendle witches were innocent. But there is a real witch in the forest of Boland. My name's Thomas, and I grew up in Barley, which is a small English village in the borough of Pendle. Most of you won't know that place. You might have never heard of the Pendle hangings, even if you do know about the famous witch trials that took place during the 17th century. You probably don't believe in superstitious nonsense. You probably think the hangings were the mark of an uncivilized era. You wouldn't be wholly wrong. It's ghastly that, throughout history, so many innocent women were murdered based on unfounded accusations of witchcraft. That doesn't mean, however, that witches aren't real, and if you'd ever stumbled across a certain house in Boland Forest, you would know that. Watch out, Sammy. The Pendle witches might turn you into one. I giggled as my 4-year-old sister nearly tripped over a toad by our local pond. I was 6 years old at the time, and I'll never forget the way my grandpa looked at me. His eyes were filled with a mixture of dread and fury. He grabbed my wrist in his gnarled, decaying fingers and left a mark that didn't fade for days. Don't you ever joke about that, he snarled. Grandpa, you're hurting me, I whined. My sister, Samantha, had stopped playing. We both quivered in the shadow of the old man who loomed above us. Am I hurtin' you? Good. Reckon that'll help you remember this lesson. There's only one witch of Pendle. She was never tried, and she never died. I don't ever want to hear you kids mention her again. Understood? My little sister was sobbing at this point, but I tried my best to put on a brave face and protect her. I always hated my grandpa. He was cruel. Still, the old bastard was certainly not creative enough to tell tall tales. And he was no liar. I didn't realize that as a young child. At the time, he seemed far worse than any witch. Get off me, I demanded. My grandpa grumbled and released me. I complained to my parents. We didn't spend weekends at his house after that. Of course, we do live in the same village. My mum pointed out, you can't avoid him forever. Just watch me. I remember thinking that. My dad pulled me aside when my mum left the room. Listen, I hate my father-in-law as much as you. He's always been a twat. Don't let your mum know I said that, he whispered. I snorted. Then, my dad's expression changed. I'd never seen him look so stern. He was always soft. He was a clown. He didn't do serious. However, I will say that I don't want you to talk about the witch again. Okay? Some things are best left alone. And I did. I left her alone for 8 years. Of course, I grew up in Pendle, so it was hard to avoid general talk of witches, especially at Halloween. That being said, I did start to notice that adults in Barley would clam up when that dreaded W word appeared in conversation. I could never understand why other towns and villages in the county of Lancashire seemed to derive great pleasure from telling scary stories about the witches of Pendle Hill, whilst people in Barley shunned the topic. I didn't hear of the real witch again until I went to a sleepover with my 4 closest friends. I suppose we were still young and foolish enough to find the myth Fascinating. And, at the age of 14, we were fueled by testosterone. We relished in discussing something forbidden. I cannot, as hard as I try, forget that weekend in December. The year was 2009. It was the coldest winter in decades. Why we chose to sleep in a treehouse on such a brutal evening, I'll never know. I suppose it was another way of proving to ourselves that we were strong. We weren't children. We sat in a circle and told each other ghost stories by torchlight. I think it might have actually been a lot of fun at first. But it's hard to remember. Everything afterwards was so horrible. The weekend's steady decline began when Michael told his story. "There is a forest," he began. "For fuck's sake, not this again." Jack groaned. "What?" Gareth asked. "Don't encourage him." Jack sighed. "I'm not sure you've got the stomach for this one." "Gareth." Michael laughed, menacingly. Bradley was snoring away at this point, and I still envy him for that. I wonder how different my life might look if I'd had the privilege of missing Michael's story. Would I have had the courage to do things differently? What about you, Tommy? Do you want to hear my story? Michael asked. I shrugged. Whatever we say, we're gonna hear it, so just get on with it. Jack nodded, agreeing with my point. Gareth lay on his front, propped on his elbows. Jack scrolled through his phone. I wrapped myself up in my sleeping bag, focusing on the icy breeze that was seeping through the cracks of the flimsy boards that formed Michael's rickety treehouse. Somehow, I knew the story he was going to tell. There once was a witch who lived in Pendle. Michael started. What? Gareth interjected. We all know about the Pendle witches. Michael glared at him. Did I say witches? Dimwit? No. I said witch. Now, shut up and listen. In 1612, 12 innocent women were convicted of 10 murders and tried for witchcraft. Not a single one of them ever harmed a soul. In the modern age, we all know that, don't we? Because witches aren't real. You dick, Jack muttered, looking down at his phone and typing away. Michael laughed maniacally. No, that's not why they were innocent. The people simply hanged the wrong women. There was only ever one real Pendle witch, and she's still out there. She lives in the forest of Boland. Hold up, Gareth said, sitting up. 1612? She's, like, 396 years old? Older than that, Michael answered. Is that it? Is that the story? Gareth asked. Jack nodded, still not looking up from his phone. Yep, that's the entire shit story. My grandpa told me about her. I finally said, once I'd rid my throat of the stubborn lump that was blocking it. Why have I never heard of this shit? Gareth laughed. That's way cooler than the original story about the Pendle witches. The original isn't a story, jackass. It's history. People were hanged. Show some respect. I said. Ooh. Jack mocked, giggling. Yeah, Gareth. Show some respect. Why cunt? Seriously. Why haven't I heard it before? Gareth asked. You never heard it because you didn't grow up in Barley. Gareth. Jack explained, still absorbed in his phone and utterly disinterested in the topic of conversation. That's what Michael always reminds me. I moved here from Clitheroe, and outsiders just don't get it. What do you mean? Gareth asked. Every Barley grown-up tells their kid that dumb story. I explained, shrugging. It's a rite of passage or some shit. I can't wait to traumatize my kids with it. Yeah, you guys are weird. Gareth laughed. This village has a real hot fuzz vibe. Move back to Chorley. Then, dickhead, Michael barked. And did I say I'd finished the story? Yes, Jack replied. No, Michael said. There's a part of the story that you haven't heard. Jack. Oh, well, please do enlighten us. Jack sighed, rolling his eyes. Michael grinned. I know where she lives. Silence. Gareth sat there, slack-jawed, staring at his idol in eager anticipation. I don't know why I instantly believed him. But I did. It was some sort of intuition. I froze and tried to force back the wave of nausea that threatened to incite a round of projectile vomiting. Jack's reaction was the most surprising. He put his phone down. Bullshit, Jack said. You're really going to give us an opportunity to call you out on one of your lies? You're going to give us a location that we could visit to prove that you're full of shit? It's not a lie, Michael assured us. She lives in a house right at the heart of the Boland Forest. I know how to find it. And how do you know that? Jack queried. It's a long-kept Barley secret. Michael explained. That's why it's only people from our village who piss their pants at the mention of Pendle witches. Only we know that she exists. Only we know where she exists. Yes, okay, but how do you know where in the forest to find her? I asked. You know Mr. Henderson, our old history teacher? Michael asked. The three of us nodded. I saw him in the pub last Wednesday. He was sitting in the corner, crying. Just him. Mrs. Henderson was at home. He's in the pub most days. Larry said. Michael explained. He's not been the same since Millie went missing. Whoa. Jack interjected. Stop. We put up with a lot of your fuckery. But I'm not going to let you bring a real-life story into this little ghost tale. That's fucked. We all knew Millie. She was a mate. Michael slammed his fist on the hardwood floor of the treehouse. For a second, it felt as if the whole structure might crumble. But it didn't. It quietened Jack. Though, it's not a fucking story. Michael growled. Let me finish, okay? This is why I invited all of you here tonight. You see, I learnt something. I talked to Mr. Henderson. Rick dared me. Rick was Michael's older brother. He was a prick. You can probably imagine what we called him behind Michael's back. And what did Mr. Henderson say? Gareth asked, now anxiously biting his nails. I asked him whether he was okay. Michael continued. I said I missed Millie. I wasn't a knob, all right? I only went over to shut Rick up. I was nice to Mr. Henderson. I didn't expect him to open up. And he opened up. He really fucking opened up. Just say it. Jack sighed. He told me that he and Millie went on a Boland hiking weekend. But they weren't really hiking. They were looking for something. The Pendle Witch. See, Mr. Henderson comes from a long line of Hendersons, one of the oldest families in Barley, and they've been passing on a warning for generations, ever since the 1600s. His family has been telling the villagers of Barley to stay away from the Boland Forest. William Henderson was the only person to ever see the witch and live to tell the tale. He wanted everyone in Barley to know about her. He wanted everyone to stay away. And they listened. Folk from other towns ignored him and said the Pendle witches had already been tried and hanged. But William was respected in our village. People trusted him and heeded his warning. Ah, some new lore. Fantastic. Jack mocked. Michael ignored him. When our Mr. Henderson, heard that story from his father, he became obsessed. You see, William Henderson told his son something that he didn't tell the rest of the villagers in Barley. It's a secret that's been kept in his family for hundreds of years. He told his son something he was too scared to tell his friends and neighbors, in case they might feel brave enough to do something about it. He told his son where the witch lived. So, when Mr. Henderson learned this family secret 400 years later, he wanted to prove that the witch was still out there. Then, Millie found his research. She wanted to go with him. She wanted to see whether the legend was true. Like her dad, she wanted to prove that a witch really exists. And Mr. Henderson just let her come with him? I asked, choking on my own words. He was excited. He said he wanted to share the adventure with his daughter. He didn't heed his own father's warning. He didn't see any danger. Or maybe, he admitted to me, he didn't really believe the witch was real at all. He was just excited to share something with Millie. Michael said, "Is that all he told you?" Gareth asked, tentatively. Michael shook his head. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that they found it. They found a house in the heart of the Boland forest. They found the witch. Mr. Henderson did not say that. Jack scoffed, but even his steady voice seemed to be waning. He did, Michael assured Jack, and she took Millie. Just took her. Gareth gulped. I tried to ask him what happened. Michael replied, he wouldn't tell me. He told me to go away. Told me some questions weren't worth answering. That, he said, was what he had finally learned. Jesus, Jack sighed, collapsing on his sleeping bag. Okay, I take it all back. Maybe you could work on the ending. But that was a good horror story. Yeah, Gareth whimpered, crawling into his own bag. I think I'm ready to call it a night before I piss my sleeping bag. Gareth and Jack fell silent. But Michael and I were still sitting up in our bags. He was staring at me with the most petrified eyes. It was a look I'd seen in the eyes of both my grandpa and my dad. True terror. It's not a story, Michael whispered, before lying down and turning off the lamp beside him. I sat there for a while longer. At this point, I wouldn't blame anyone for thinking the tale to be make-believe. But it's not about the words. It's about the feeling. Maybe it's something only Barley folk can understand. Like Michael, I'd caught the fever. I'd seen the witch, not physically, but in my mind, in my dreams. She felt real to me. I didn't need to go to the heart of Boland Forest to find out whether she was real. I already believed. The next morning, I woke to the sensation of something heavy landing on my chest. It was my rucksack. What the fuck's this? We going on a hike? Bradley asked, throwing his bag off his body. Michael was dressed in full hiking gear and standing by the open trapdoor to the treehouse. You slept through some weird shit last night, mate. Gareth laughed, sitting up in his sleeping bag and rubbing his eyes. The Pendle Witch, Jack clarified. Oh, right. Bit old for ghost stories. Aren't we, lads? Bradley chuckled. You'll grow up eventually. Don't worry. You're the same age as us. Bradley, Jack pointed out. Anyway, Michael's updated the legend. He added a pretty freaky story at the end. Actually, gave it a spooky update. I was impressed. It's real, Michael explained. And we're going to find her. Who? Bradley asked. snorting with laughter. "Millie," Michael answered. Everybody fell silent. Jack scolded him. "Michael, don't be a twat. Man, you're pushing it too far now. The girl's dead. Mr. Henderson told me everything that I told you last night. Believe it or don't, I couldn't give a shit. I know Tom believes me," Michael said. Suddenly, all eyes were on me. I looked down at the rucksack on my lap. "I do believe you," I said. "Well, I believe that something bad happened to Millie out in that forest. So, why the fuck would we go out there? Yeah, witch or no witch, I think I'm gonna pass on that one," Bradley said. "I don't want to find some dead body." "I thought you were saying we all needed to grow up." Michael pointed out. "And you said it yourself. Nobody ever found her body. She's still out there. She might still be alive." "She wasn't, even then. I knew that. But I also knew that Michael loved her. He had always loved her. She'd softened his coarseness. And he'd returned to being a full-blown arsehole when she went missing. But maybe this wasn't just about finding her. Maybe, as had been the case with Mr. Henderson, Michael had the obsession, the itch, the bug. He had to find the witch. And then I had a horrible thought. A thought that sickened me to the very core of my being. Maybe that was what the witch wanted. Maybe that was how she found her prey. She got into their heads and lured them to her lair. I'd love to give you an answer. But I don't know. Even after what happened. A group of 14-year-olds searching for a dead body in the forest. Gareth said, "Sounds like Stand By Me. Everything's a fucking reference with this guy." Bradley laughed. "Forget it, lads. I'm going home. I'll tell the villagers of Barley about your brave sacrifice. Safe travels, my friends." And then he disappeared through the trapdoor. Whatever. That fat, lazy shit would only slow us down, Michael said. His words were pure vitriol at this point. His eyes were bloodshot. It looked as if he hadn't slept all night. I know I hadn't. I'd barely managed more than a couple of hours. There was no way I was going on a hike in this sleep-deprived state. Anyway, I had the excuse that any 14-year-old would have. "My parents won't let me," I said. "Oh, shut the fuck up," Michael moaned. "I got your precious permission slips. My folks rang your parents last night. How would we even get to Boland Forest?" "Mate," Jack pointed out, "it's a bit far on foot." "Ready, shit stains?" came a voice from the bottom of the ladder. We all gathered around the trapdoor and looked down to see Rick standing at the foot of the tree with a set of car keys dangling from his fingers. My heart sank. It was at that moment I realized I had no escape. Michael wasn't going to take no for an answer. In the 10 years we had been friends, he had never taken no for an answer. And yet, naively, I had hoped this would be the exception. As everyone started climbing down the ladder, I remember looking at Michael with tears in my eyes. I tried my best to hold them back. I'd accepted the inevitable, but we shared a look. I think, for a moment, his expression was apologetic. It was as if he were under the witch's spell. He probably would have let Gareth or Jack walk away if they'd really wanted to do so. But he wouldn't let me. I was his rock. So, we all piled into Rick's battered old camper van, bringing rucksacks filled with supplies that Michael had gathered before we even woke up, and said goodbye to our parents, who were standing and waving in the front yard of Michael's house. Everything was arranged. And our parents were happy for us to go camping as long as Rick and Stacy, his girlfriend, looked after us on the trip and brought us back before 6 o'clock on Sunday night. I watched Pendle Hill from the car window and thought about how beautiful it looked in the early morning sun. I wished, more than anything, that we were going on a pleasant stroll up the hill to find the witch. Anywhere but the forest. Haven't you got anything better to do than hang out with a bunch of 14-year-olds? Rick? Jack teased, making Gareth snort. Yeah, of course. Rick replied, I'm gonna feed you fucks to the witch. That sounds much better than hanging out with you. Rick, don't be mean. They're just kids. Stacy protested. Aren't you guys only, like, 18? Gareth asked. 19. Rick corrected. Ooh, sorry, Mr. 19-year-old. Gareth responded, making Jack laugh. You two make a cute couple. Rick retorted, which silenced Gareth and Jack for a while. So, why do you boys really want to go to Boland? Stacy asked. Shouldn't you be busy playing Call of Duty or something? They're going to sit around the campfire and jerk off to each other's ghost stories. Rick answered. Ew. Gareth groaned. You should be on some kind of register. Jack added. We're just going on a hike. Michael explained, coldly, as he stared vacantly out of the passenger window. I don't believe you, Rick replied, shaking his head. You're a shit liar. Little brother. How about you shut the fuck up and mind your own business? Michael asked. Whoa. How about you remember who's driving you to your new little sleepover spot? Rick pointed out. Silence. Anyway, I know you're looking for the witch. Bradley told me, Rick said. Michael didn't say anything. He just continued to watch the scenery flood past the window. I don't really give a shit. Stacy and I won't be going on your little hike. Though, we'll be staying behind and having some, alone time, Rick said. What? But Mum said, Michael began. Yeah, I know, Rick interrupted. We'll set up camp and make some food whilst you go on your little adventure. So, don't walk too far, okay? I don't want to have to go looking for you in that creepy-ass forest. Michael sighed. Fine. Just don't eat everything whilst we're gone. You greedy shit. Fuck you. Rick laughed. I listened to music on my iPod for the rest of the trip. I tried to convince myself it wasn't happening. I tried to convince myself that the witch wasn't real, which I'm sure you're already doing. But you just don't get it. Michael's right. People from Barley are different. The witch has some sort of hold over us. I always believed my grandpa. Deep down, I just didn't want to admit it. I won't tell you where we camped. I don't want some ignorant person to stumble across this story and decide they want to go looking for the witch. Don't do it. Rick was most certainly a prick. But he looked after us. I can't really fault him. On this trip, he was kinder than usual. The teasing started to fade as we drove closer to the forest. He became like Michael and me. He grew quiet, fearful. He was a Barley lad. After all, he might not know Mr. Henderson's story. But everybody in the village feels something about the witch. Like I said, I can't really explain it. You've got 2 hours, Rick said, as he and Stacy started to put up the tents. That's not enough time, Michael protested, clicking together the rucksack straps across his chest. 2 hours, Rick repeated, fiercely. We didn't question him. Everyone was on edge. Even Jack and Gareth seemed to sense that something was wrong with the Barley kids. They seemed a little nervous. We'd infected them with our superstitious fear. So, we just blindly walk through trees? Jack asked. Henderson told me where to go. Michael explained. You don't have a map or something? Gareth asked. No, Gareth, I don't have a map. Michael sighed. Let me guess. Jack said. It's a Barley thing? Michael didn't respond. Gareth turned to face me. I was walking at the back of the line as we weaved between tall trees. What's the time? He asked me. My phone's dead. Already? Jack laughed. Fuck me. You wouldn't last 2 seconds on your own. Shut the fuck up. I would have charged it before we left. But somebody didn't even tell us we were going on a camping trip this weekend. Gareth shouted. Nobody forced you. Michael said. You always force Tom. He feels sorry for you. We all do. So, we go along with what you say. Jack said. Or maybe I'm just the alpha of the group and you'd all be lost without me. Michael suggested, laughing. Bollocks. Jack retorted. You throw a hissy fit when you don't get your way. We were just avoiding a scene. Keep telling yourself that. Michael replied. I'm here for Millie. You only want to find the witch. And maybe you feel guilty about that. It's okay. I looked at my phone and finally answered Gareth's original question. 12:57. Okay, Gareth said. So, we turn around and head back to camp at 2 o'clock. Right? We turn around when we've found Millie. Michael answered, marching forwards. Michael, we're not going to find Millie. Jack said, his tone becoming aggressive. We're not going to find anything. We're turning around at 2 in the afternoon. And we'll get back to the camp at 3. Yeah, I'll be hungry by then. I haven't even had lunch. Gareth said, I packed everything we need. Michael explained, there are crisps in your bag. Eat up, and shut up. Other than the sound of Gareth munching. We were silent for a little while. A long while. Actually, after about an hour, I looked at my phone screen. Shit, it's 2:07. I said, come on, Michael, let's turn around. The sun will have almost set by the time we get back. We're nearly there, Michael insisted. We can't turn back now. Well, I'm turning around, Gareth said, spinning on his heel and stomping past me. Fuck this. Fine. Go, pussy. Michael spat. We're all going, Jack said, firmly, trying to be the leader. Michael asked, turning around and squaring up to Jack. You haven't got the balls. We don't have a leader. Jack replied, standing his ground. Stop being a cunt and come back with us. Nah, I'll just do it on my own. Michael mumbled, continuing on his way without us. We should go after him. I sighed. Fuck that guy. Jack said, I'm not gonna get lost in the middle of this forest in the dark. And neither are you. Come back with us. He'll turn around. He can't do anything without you. Tom. I begrudgingly followed Gareth and Jack back to camp. I hoped they were right. I hoped Michael would get cold feet and follow us. He didn't. We were all starting to feel the chill of Boland Forest as the sky turned a mesmerizing shade of orange and eased into darkness. The hour-long walk back to camp passed quickly. When we arrived, however, the site was deserted. There were 3 fully pitched tents and a smoldering pile of logs. In the dirt, there was an open packet of marshmallows. Some were lost in the mud. There were 6 camp chairs. 2 of them were also lying in the mud. Thanks for ruining the marshmallows. Jackass. Gareth yelled at no one. Where are they? Jack asked, walking over to the camper van. They're not in here. Then, we heard a haunting sound. A razor-sharp scream that pierced the air and caused the 3 of us to immediately throw our hands to our ears. What the fuck? Gareth cried, shaken. That sounded like a woman. It must have been Stacy, I said. Oh, Jack said, lowering his hands from his ears. I get it. What? I asked. They're fucking with us. Michael, Rick, and Stacy. They're fucking with us. Guys, they planned this whole trip to scare us. Jack said, before starting to bellow. Nice prank. Guys, you can come out now. Nothing. I guess they're really committing to the bit. Gareth suggested, gulping. Jack pointed to the forest. Only a few hundred yards from the field we'd chosen for our campsite. They're hiding behind some trees and giggling. Jack explained. Fuck him, I say. Let's eat some grub and wait for them to get bored. I'm freezing my tits off out here. And they must be cold. 2. We'll restart the campfire to draw them to us. Gareth and I followed Jack's lead, sitting in 2 of the still-standing camp chairs and proceeding to roast some marshmallows. Half an hour passed, then an hour, then another, and another. 6:30 p.m. It's pitch black and freezing cold out there. Why would they still be pranking us? Gareth asked. I don't know, and I don't really care. Those brothers are assholes. Jack sighed, picking up the portable stove and throwing it at me. Feel like cooking us some proper food. Champ? I looked up from my lap. I'd been sitting there, silently, contemplating everything Michael had told us. There was a cutting breeze in the air. Something unnatural. The campfire had warmed us up. But I felt a different kind of coldness. Something I can't explain. Everything felt wrong. I pushed it aside. I did as Jack said. I wasn't being a pushover. I just preferred his plan of staying away from the forest. I was scared. I was a coward. And I know I was a coward because I knew that Scream had been real. I knew something had happened to Stacy, Rick, and possibly even Michael. He'd been gone for hours. I cooked some sausages and clumsily shoved them in buns, passing them shakily to Gareth and Jack. We ate in silence. My friends weren't their usual chatty selves. And I know they wouldn't ever have admitted it. But they were scared. They were starting to have their doubts about the whole thing being a prank. It wasn't until 8 o'clock that any of us said anything. And it wasn't who you'd expect to speak up. Something's wrong, Gareth said, leaping out of his chair. We have to go and find them. I pulled my earphones out. And Jack put his phone down. It's cold. And it's dark. Jack replied. You really want to go out there? They're not pranking us. Gareth whispered, quivering. We've been here for 5 hours. They're not pranking us. I think we should all just go to bed and wait until morning. Jack said, it'll be light, and we can figure out what's happening. Plus, they'll probably have caved and crawled back into their tents. Or maybe they're camping out there on their own. They don't have any supplies. I pointed out. They left everything here. The place was a mess. There was that scream. Gareth's right. Something's wrong. Fuck, Tom. Well, what do you want to do? Jack asked. The 2 of them looked at me. I didn't want to march into the forest and save anyone. I wanted to go home. I think we need to phone our parents and tell them something's wrong, I said. Jack and Gareth groaned. Great idea. That's a sure way for us to never be allowed to do anything like this again. Gareth sighed. Something might have happened to them. I insisted. We have to be sensible. Guys, I'm all for avoiding the forest. Tom, but we're not snitching to our parents. Fuck that, Jack said, shaking his head. Two options. We go to sleep, or we search for them. I vote we search for them. Gareth said. I vote we go to bed. Jack said, turning to me. Deciding vote. Tom, Michael's not here now. This is finally a democracy. I looked down at the campfire, wishing for Rick, Stacy, and Michael to come running out of the trees with smiles on their faces. But they didn't, and I had to make a decision. I wanted to phone my parents. I wanted to run back to Barley. If necessary, I could have followed the dirt path back to the main road. 5 hours, I reckoned. 5 hours to walk home. I wish I'd done that. But peer pressure is a supernatural force of its own. Foolishly, I voted to search for our missing friends. I might have been a coward, but I couldn't live with the prospect of cozying up in a tent whilst something unholy was happening in the heart of that dreadful forest. So, guided by the torches that Michael had packed for us, we delved into the forest. Jack and I had gone to scouts together, but we were not equipped for this. We had no idea how to navigate the forest of Boland at night. We had no idea how to track missing people. Instead, we were guided by adrenaline, boyish stupidity, and perhaps a smidge of bravery. Stacy, are you okay? I called. Rick, Michael, Gareth shouted. Not a sound, not even the rustling of tree leaves. Such an icy night, and yet the air was still. So, why could I still feel wisps of wind, like winter's breath, washing over my flesh? I can forgive Gareth and Jack for ignorantly running into the witch's forest. But I should have known better. Everyone from Barley knows better. This is hopeless, Gareth cried. We should head. Oh, fuck, Jack interrupted, lifting his boot out of something that made a squelching noise. What the fucking fuck is this? Gareth and I slowly walked towards our crouching friend, casting our torch lights onto what he held in his hands. God, Gareth shuddered, before turning and vomiting behind him. Jack immediately dropped the squishy object, trembling as he returned to reality and finally realized what he'd picked up with his bare hands. It's a sight that haunts me to this day. A heart, a human heart. I'm no biologist, but I knew it was human. No, 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 Jack cried. We have to find them, I said, calmly. I was stunned by my balanced composure. Perhaps I wasn't a coward, after all, or perhaps I was in shock. I'd probably know if I were ever to see a therapist, but I'm sure they'd have me committed if I were ever to tell them the rest of the story that I'm about to tell you. You see, I'd love to say that Gareth and Jack didn't listen to me. I'd love to say that they decided we should go back to the tents. But we were boys, and boys follow leaders. In the absence of Michael, I seemed to have assumed that role. Perhaps that would have always been my role in the friendship group if I'd ever fought for it. Perhaps I could have challenged Michael in the treehouse and prevented any of this from happening. What if, as we marched onwards, I felt a renewed sense of confidence, something I hadn't possessed since the age of 6. Before my grandpa and dad had traumatized me into being a sheltered little lamb. I wish I'd stayed a frightened lamb, rather than the dumb oaf who decided to delve deeper into the woods. What was that? Gareth whimpered. What was what? I asked, as we continued to walk through the blackened forest. I heard something behind me, Gareth whispered. I stopped walking and turned around, casting the torch light onto my two friends. The color left my face, and any ounce of courage swiftly vacated my body. I screamed. I screamed louder than I knew I could scream. There was a figure behind Jack. A pale woman was strolling between the trees. I thought it was the witch. Help, she wheezed, weakly. It wasn't the witch. It was Stacy. The three of us rushed over to her, and Gareth dived to cushion her fall as her knees buckled and she fell to the ground. What happened? Jack asked, kneeling beside her. I was relieved to see that she didn't seem to have a cavernous hole in her chest. But whose heart was it? That was all we wanted to know. Anyway, that didn't mean Stacy looked physically well. She didn't. Her face was gray, as if the blood had been drained from her body. Rick, she sobbed, pressing her face into Gareth's shirt. He disappeared. What do you mean? I asked. Where did he go? We were at the camp. Stacy sniffled. He said he heard something. I thought he was playing a cruel joke on me. He said she was calling to him. He said he had to find her. Who? Gareth asked. Millie. Stacy whispered. How did you end up out here? Did you follow him? Jack asked. Stacy nodded. I saw something. I don't know. Please, we have to go. We have to find Rick and Michael. I pleaded. She shook her head. No, they're gone. We found you, so we can find them. I insisted. Gareth and Jack were in a state of uncontrollable panic. We were children. It's hard to understand that when you're young. But I saw it for a brief, fleeting moment. Then, I snapped back into my leadership role. I don't know why. I think I wanted to prove something to myself. I wanted to be brave. I wanted to be a hero. Rick, Stacy whined. He tore out his. The four of us fell silent. Gareth turned paler than Stacy, pulling himself away from her so he could empty his guts into a nearby bush. She didn't need to finish her sentence. We knew what he tore out. We didn't, however, expect her to say what she said next. And after he did that, after he tore out, he just carried on walking. She sobbed. What? Jack asked. Where's his body? Stacy? Listen to me, she pleaded, assuming a fetal position on the ground. He didn't die. He walked away. We still need to find Michael, I stated, firmly. Stacy sat upright and screamed at me. You don't know what I saw. It sounds horrible, but I started. Not that, she interrupted. That was only the start. I told you. I saw something. I want to go home. Gareth cried, and Jack hugged him. So does Michael, I said. Whatever Stacy saw, he's still out there. We have to save him. Jack stopped hugging Gareth, and he walked slowly towards me. There was such a disgusted look on his face. Rick's dead. Tom and Michael isn't here. For all we know, that little psycho is the one who did this. He's the reason we're all here. Isn't he? There's always been something wrong with him. Something wrong with his mind. So, no, I'm not going to risk my life for him. Nobody else is dying tonight. That doesn't explain what Rick did. I replied. That doesn't explain what Stacy saw. We have to go, Stacy cried, stumbling to her feet and tugging at Gareth's sleeve. Jack whispered to me, Stacy's got fucking PTSD or some shit. I don't fucking know. Wake the fuck up, Tom. Rick didn't rip his heart out and walk away. No, something else did it to him. I muttered, trying to repress the fear that was clawing at the surface of my mind. Jack suddenly shoved me to the ground. It knocked the wind right out of me. I looked up at him in confusion, pulling myself to my feet. Guys, Gareth protested. Shut the fuck up, Gareth, Jack shouted. Are you really trying to say what I think you're trying to say? Tommy? I held up my hands. I know you don't believe. There is no fucking witch. Has everybody lost their minds? Jack belted at the top of his lungs. Then, there was the faint sound of humming. We all stopped and listened. Stacy looked bewildered, wiping the tears from her face and watching we three boys exchange horrified looks at one another. Millie, Gareth whispered, sobbing. That's her favorite song. I cried, fervently clinging to my last strand of sanity. She'd be told off for humming it in class. What are you saying? Stacy cried. I don't hear any humming. Please. This is all in your heads. Don't leave me. Not like Rick. Michael. Jack said. It has to be Michael. He's toying with us. It isn't Michael. Stacy screeched. We have to leave this place. I agree. Jack replied. Let's go. Fuck you, Michael. Fuck you. You guys get Stacy back to camp. I have to keep going. I said, what was propelling me forwards? The farther we walked, the sicker I felt in the pit of my stomach. And, yet, as we vanished into the heart of the forest, the more compelled I felt to find whatever I was trying to find. It wasn't Michael. I knew that much. Stacy wailed. No, please. I can't leave you on your own. Please, don't make me come with you. We need to go back to the camp. Come on, Tom, Jack said, putting a hand on my shoulder and speaking more gently. You've done enough for him. You don't have to keep going. You're not under his spell anymore. With tears in my eyes, I smiled at my dear friend and said something that I wouldn't understand until later. I'm sorry. I kept walking. I knew that Gareth, Stacy, and Jack would follow. They did not protest, but Stacy continued to cry. The boys followed the siren call of Millie's hum. As I did, then, we saw it, something none of us had really expected to see. A house, little more than a derelict shed. Really, situated in the midst of this dense tree cluster was a tiny little house. What the fuck is this? Gareth asked. What is this house doing out here? I don't like it, Jack whispered. The voice is coming from there. I said, it's a trap. Stacy said, she's not really in there. And you know it. You know it. Tom, please, stop this. I have to go inside. Millie and Michael are in there. I said, I cannot describe how I felt. I was not possessed. I did not hear the cackling voice of some sinister witch in my head. There were no demons telling me to kill my friends. I felt entirely in control of my limbs and my mind. Nonetheless, I was not myself. I was filled with an urge to go into that haunted hellhole. I started to walk towards the front door, but Stacy barged past me, still sobbing her heart out. I suddenly realized she had Gareth's torch in her hand. Let me, I remember her crying as she sprinted towards the door. She thought she was protecting us. She thought she was the grown-up, and we all thought that at the time. But she was 19. She was a child, just like us. Stacy grabbed the door handle, shaking as she did so, and called out, Millie, Michael, are you in there? I'm going to come in. Gareth, Jack, and I stood a few yards behind her. We waited with bated breath, wondering what could possibly lie inside. It was too dark for us to see. Stacy opened the door, revealing nothing but darkness. She slowly lifted her torch, and we all breathed a collective sigh of relief. It was just a house. She stood in a narrow hallway with doors lining either side, and there was a painting on the wall at the end. I couldn't quite make out the picture from that distance, but it looked familiar. Stacy stepped inside, shining her light onto each of the doors and calling out for Millie and Michael again. Faster than any gust of wind could have carried it, the front door slammed behind her. She screamed. Stacy, Gareth yelled, lunging at the door. He and Jack started ramming their shoulders into it, whilst I simply clasped both of my hands onto my head, dropping my torch to the ground. What had I done? Where had I led us? I still wanted to believe it wasn't real. This was just a house. Rick, Michael, and Stacy were pranking us. That heart was fake. It wasn't real. Tommy, Jack shouted, slamming into the door that wouldn't budge. Help us. I snapped out of it and joined my friends. Eventually, the latch snapped and the door flew open. My bravery seemed to have abandoned me, so I let Jack take charge. He led the way with his torch, and I followed, too mentally broken to remember to pick up my fallen torch. We stepped into the house. I don't know why. I think we all knew that they were gone. We just couldn't accept it. Or maybe that same force, the same thing that hummed at us, was drawing us inside. Stacy, Jack shouted. Which door? Stacy? The house was a bungalow, and it only had one hallway with 6 doors. There were 6 rooms that could be holding our friends, one at a time, Jack said, opening the first door on his left. Gareth and I cowered behind him, watching as he illuminated the first room. There was nothing in there but a pile of rucksacks. They're rucksacks. They're here, Gareth whispered. They have to be here. Jack quietly closed the door, and we shuffled across the hallway to the first door on the right. A bedroom. There were scribblings on the walls in some language we couldn't understand. 4 more rooms. With each door we opened, my throat seemed to close a little more tightly. The second door on the left offered nothing but a book on the floor. Jack cast his torch on it. The Pied Piper of Barley was the title on the front. Where are you? Gareth screamed into the empty space. Jack clasped a hand to our friend's mouth and, with his torch holding hand, he raised a finger to his lips. Gareth nodded, and we shuffled silently across the hallway. It was the second door on the right that gave Jack a reason to hesitate. He placed his hand on the door handle. Stand back, Jack said. I don't. Something about this room. Do you hear that? Hear what? I asked, feebly. Of its own accord, the door to the 4th room flew open. What we saw next is something that I cannot explain. There stood Stacy, with her face contorted in a way that defied all laws of nature's. All I can tell you is that her eyes were gone. Her sockets were 2 black chasms. Stacy was gone. She looked as if she had stared into the face of fear itself. The worst part was that she was still alive. She lifted a shaky arm and stretched her bony fingers towards us. I think she wanted help. I think she wanted death. Stacy, Gareth cried, squeezing between Jack and me. He knocked Jack's arm as he ran into the room, and the torch went flying out of his hand. Gareth, wait, Jack screamed. The door slammed behind him. Without the last torch, we had been plunged into complete darkness. I was too afraid to walk back outside and find mine. Jack fiddled with the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Neither of us had the energy left to fight it. I think we realized we couldn't fight it. I realized I had my phone, so I slid it from my pocket. I used the flashlight to find Jack, who was leaning with his back against the now closed fourth door. He had his hands on his knees. "They're not making a sound in there," he said. "Nobody leaves this house, do they?" "I don't think so," I replied, solemnly, casting the light on the third right-hand door. 2 more rooms. Tom, Millie is gone. Rick is gone. Stacy is gone. And now, Gareth. Jack stopped, stifling his tears. Michael is gone, too. You know that. I paused. I think Michael's here. Maybe. Jack nodded. And maybe he's fucked up like everyone else. Look, I've seen some shit I can't explain. Okay? I believe in the fucking witch. You and I can still make it out of here. I ignored Jack and walked over to the third door on the right. We'd reached the end of the hallway, and I remembered something. The painting. I slowly lifted my phone light to get a better look at it. It was a picture of a pond with 3 figures standing beside it: a boy, a girl, and an old man. That's when I realized it was my grandpa, Sammy, and me. It was a painting of that day. In the picture, my grandpa was clutching my wrist. The brush strokes captured that horrifying expression he'd worn on his face as he told me of the real Pendle witch. "It's me. That's me in the painting," I whispered. "What the fuck are you saying?" Jack cried from behind me. "Let's go whilst we still can." "Tom." But I couldn't. I reached for the door handle to the third room on the right and lightly pushed it open. Inside, there was a boy standing up and a boy lying at his feet. "Rick and Michael." "Rick," I gently whispered. I had my light firmly fixated on his looming figure. He shuffled around to look at us. There was a bloody hole in the center of his jumper, and he revealed a face even ghastlier than the one we had just seen on Stacy. Unlike her, Rick did not look as if he had seen the face of fear. He did not look scared at all. In fact, beneath the black, empty holes where his eyes used to be, he wore a toothy, blood grin that stretched from ear to ear. It haunts me. I still see Rick's face. I still see him raising a finger to his lips and making a shushing sound. I remember his wheezy laugh. I remember him pointing at the floor behind him, unable to utter a peep. I shakily moved my phone light to the floor. There lay the partially massacred body of Michael. He was missing an arm, 2 of his legs, and both of his eyes. But they weren't black holes like the ones that Stacy and Rick had. They were bloody wounds. Claw marks ran down his face. He was pointing at something in the corner of the room. "I found her," Michael groaned. "The witch made Henderson do it." I leaned around the doorframe and cast my light into the corner. There it was, A pile of bones wearing hiking clothes. Millie. I finally started to cry. And when I turned around to find Jack, he was gone. It was just me, Michael, and what used to be Rick. Jack? I screamed. Nothing. The fifth door slammed in my face. The brothers were gone. Jack was gone. I found myself standing alone in the hallway. I could feel a weight lifting from my mind, as if I had been in a trance and now I could see. I wondered why I was still in that house. I turned on my heel and eyeballed the open doorway that led back out into the forest. But something still had my body. I couldn't move, and that was when the sixth and final door creaked open. The third door on the left. I found my feet carrying me towards it. I remember glancing at the painting at the end of the hallway before I entered the room. The three figures were gone. There was a silhouette between the painted trees. It moved out of sight. I found myself standing in the last room, and the door closed behind me. It was cold like no coldness I'd ever felt and dark like no darkness I'd ever seen. I felt my arm moving. I couldn't stop it. My phone light was moving across the walls, slowly making its way towards something at the back of the room. No, I cried, trying desperately to stop myself. I didn't want to see what was at the back of the room. I could hear breathing. I couldn't move my limbs, but I could move my lips. Wait, I pleaded. Why did you let William Henderson live? My arms stopped. My whole body stopped. The breathing stopped, whilst I had control of my limbs. I let the phone drop to the floor. It landed face up, so the flashlight was pressed against the floor. I breathed a sigh of relief. I didn't want to be forced to see what Stacy and Rick had seen. Made a deal? A voice whispered. It wasn't the voice of a woman. It wasn't the voice of a man. I always say it was the devil, but I do that to help myself sleep at night. Truthfully, whatever was in that room scared me more than the devil. What deal? I whimpered. I'll never forget seeing her blackened silhouette as she moved in front of the one window in the room. Dim moonlight wasn't dim enough to completely hide her. 7 foot tall, gangly limbs, and a head far bigger than that of any human. I see her in my dreams. I see her in my waking hours. I'm lucky I dropped the phone. Would I be like Stacy or Rick if I'd seen her in the light? Must feed. That was all she said before I passed out. But I knew what she wanted. She'd already told me what I needed to do. The book on the floor. The Pied Piper of Barley. She would let me live. But I had to continue what William Henderson had started. The tales he told the villagers of Barley had been leading victims to the witch for years. Maybe he hadn't given exact directions, but all it takes is a spark, an idea. Of course, everyone in Barley knows the story, but not everyone feels the pull. Maybe it only works on the broken. Mr. Henderson ignited that spark in Michael. He planted the idea of the witch, and Michael did the rest. I like to think our dear old history teacher did not willingly lead his daughter to the slaughter, just as Michael did not willingly lead our friends to that house. Mr. Henderson was just a fool who learned the hard way what his ancestor had really done to make it out of the Boland house alive. And, like the Hendersons, I knew what needed to be done. When I woke in the morning, I was back at the campsite. I rang my parents and told them that everyone had gone missing in the woods. I told them they tried to find Millie, but I stayed in the tent. I'm 27. It's been 13 years. And the families of my friends still hunt for their missing children. But they don't know where to look. I could have told them where to go. But the witch would not have taken kindly to an angry mob. I misdirected the police, and her house was never found. Not everyone in Barley is prey. Some of us are just storytellers. The witches Pied Pipers. Speaking of which, I still see Mr. Henderson in the village from time to time. I think he knows what I am. I think he knows what I've done. He shames me with a glare, but no more than he shames himself. Heed my warning. The Pendle Witch is real. She's something far older than you or me. And she's hungry. Very hungry. I think you know why I've told you this story. I think you finally understand. I'm sorry. It's an idea, and I have to plant it. If you feel something pulling you deep into the forest of Boland, please forgive me. Story. Before you go to bed tonight, there's something you need to check. It just might save your life. When I was maybe 8 or 9, I had one of those nights where I just couldn't sleep. The room was a little too hot, and I'd spent the whole day inside eating popsicles and watching TV. Now, there was this weird buzzing in my ears, and my whole body felt twitchy, like it was punishing me for spending the day on the couch. Worst of all was my pillow. It had never been this lumpy before. The case had gotten sweaty right away, and then it was like immediately wet again after I turned it over. No matter how much I tossed and turned, I just couldn't get comfortable. Finally, I got up and walked downstairs, where my dad was watching baseball. Seeing me, he muted it and asked if I needed anything. I shrugged. My pillow sucks. That's all. He nodded. Then he got this weird smile and said, "Maybe it's Mr. Pillow. First, you kind of need to know that my dad is a total goofball. My mom had left when my sister Madison and I were little. But he had stepped up in a big way, loving us double. He was always the one to tell us stupid ghost stories on camping trips about demon-possessed deer or bears who loved the smell of girls' shampoo. And then of course he'd come rattle the tent in the middle of the night and scare us out of our minds. I'm just going to get some water and then head back to bed," I said. I looked over at the TV. The Brewers were losing by like 8 runs. So maybe he was trying to distract himself. "He was a real creep," said my dad, ignoring me. Of course, he wasn't called the Mr. Pillow back then. I think his name was Douglas something. Loved sneaking into kids' rooms and then strangling them to death. "Thanks for that," I said, pouring myself a glass of water. "That's definitely going to help me sleep." "Of course. They caught him eventually," said my dad. "Big trial and everything. But before he ever got convicted, his cellmate suffocated him to death with a pillow." "Got it," I said. I turned to the fridge and found some leftover pizza. Then I carefully started picking off the pepperoni as my dad continued. "The weird thing came the next night," said my dad. "They found the cellmate dead too. Suffocated. Except there'd been no one in the cell to do the deed." Now I know what you're thinking. It was probably the guards. Right? Maybe. But then other people started dying. Other prisoners who'd messed Douglas. All suffocated in their beds. That's when they started calling him Mr. Pillow. "Ooh," I said. "So spooky." And then kids in the neighborhood near the prison started dying too, said my dad. Their moms would come in and find them dead in their beds. And the only thing linking the deaths was that some of the kids had mentioned being uncomfortable in their beds the night before, asking if their parents had switched out the pillows or anything. "Dad," I said, "this is the dumbest thing ever. Just stop." And then in the morning, they'd find the kids' old pillows stashed away somewhere. And on the bed, there'd be no pillow at all, like it had just disappeared. I didn't even acknowledge that last part. I just hit the bathroom and walked up to bed. Soon enough, I heard the sounds of the baseball game come back on the TV as my dad unmuted it. Then, as I approached my room, I swore I heard footsteps and the creak of a window. I walked inside and looked at my bed. And I'm not fucking kidding. There was no pillow on my bed. The window was open a crack, and I ran over to it. It was dark and rainy outside, and I didn't see anyone out there. Finally, I closed the window, making sure it was locked tight. My heart was beating about 1,000 beats a minute now. I walked over to my closet and opened it. Inside, I saw my usual pillow sitting on the floor. I screamed and ran downstairs as fast as I could. "Dad," I shouted. He turned the game off right away and ran over to me. I tried to explain about the window, the pillow, everything. It was just a stupid story, right? I asked. "The stupidest." My dad nodded. "I just made it up." He said, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have scared you." "Mr. Pillow? Really? I thought you were old enough. And it wouldn't freak you out." The whole time he was talking though, he looked kind of nervous. Suddenly, his eyes went wide. "Wait here on the couch," he said. I'd better run up and check on Maddie. I'd never seen my dad run so fast. He pounded up the stairs 2 at a time. And the whole time he was gone, I imagined my little sister dead, or dying, screaming for her life as the soft pillow wrapped around her face, choking the life out of her. I couldn't believe I'd run downstairs without checking on her first. A few seconds later, he came down, my sleeping sister in his arms. I was thinking it might be a fun night for us all to cuddle up on the couch. He said, "What do you think?" My dad never mentioned Mr. Pillow again after that. But of course, he didn't have to. Even now that I'm in my 30s, I still double-check the inside label of my pillow every night before I go to sleep, making sure it's the usual one. Every once in a while, I still hear about some kid in my town dying overnight. Of course, I have my theory about what happened, but I figure there's no point in sharing it. Who would ever believe a story as stupid as Mr. Pillow? Right? I'm sorry. I know how this all sounds. I just wanted to share it in case it helps someone else out there. Before you go to bed tonight, just check inside your pillowcase. Make sure you recognize the label inside. It just might save your life. Story. Convicted for the gruesome murder of his wife. I think something else happened. Mr. Romero. I tried to keep my voice stern, but I couldn't help the strong pleading undertone that broke through. What happened to Teresa? A small flicker of emotion crossed his face at hearing her name, but vanished almost instantly. At this point, 15 years later, her name had become a distant memory, a word he hadn't heard in a long time. Still, it was clear that her name touched a nerve. I've already told you everything I know. His voice was rugged, dry. His words sounded scripted and meaningless. Not me. I leaned forward, trying, unsuccessfully, to keep eye contact. I'm looking at your case with new eyes. I want to hear your personal account of that night." Romero chuckled. "New eyes? You gotta be fucking kidding me. You've looked over the case." "Yeah?" His eyes met mine, cold and blackened. "You already think I'm guilty. Don't waste my fucking time." "Are you? Am I what?" He was getting aggravated. His upper lip pulled into a left-sided snarl. "Guilty? What do you think?" On February 12, 2008, Teresa Romero was found murdered in her family home on Zorn Avenue. After her neighbor hadn't heard from her in several days, she called for a wellness check. Officer Christensen arrived at her residence at 0950, noting a 1995 Ford Explorer and 2000 Ford Taurus parked in the driveway. The officer noticed an abundance of flies in the window, and no answer after knocking on the front door. With suspicion that the resident may be in trouble, the officer entered the home through the unlocked front door. Officer Christensen was an experienced officer of 23 years. Less than a week after the discovery of Teresa's body, he handed in his formal resignation. The small home looked as if a massacre took place. Blood covered the walls in dried, crusted splatters. The ceilings, furniture, everything was stained with either blood or viscera. Patches of auburn hair hung in webs. Body parts haphazardly amputated and thrown around the room, as if someone was trying to make the biggest mess they possibly could. A lump of flesh and bones lay seeping deep into the carpet, the shredded remains of Teresa Romero. In the middle of the living room, sitting on the couch with a stoic expression, was Manny Romero. "I don't think anything," I said finally, breaking the long silence between us. "Like I said, new eyes." Romero shook his head, leaning further back into the thin metal chair. For a moment, he seemed to ponder, but with a quick clench of his jaw, he brought himself back to the present. "Would I be in here otherwise?" His eyes drifted to the cell around us, landing on the handcuffs attaching him firmly to the table separating us. "You think I took a life sentence for the hell of it? The thing is, Mr. Romero has never once said the words, 'I'm guilty,' or 'I did it.' His stories never delve into what happened the night Teresa died. All the signs pointed to him. The husband who was there, alone, with the victim. No one else was placed at the Romero home the night everything happened. But he was clean. Not a drop of blood on him when Officer Christensen arrived at the scene. His body showed no signs of a struggle. He never tried to leave the house or run away. In fact, when he received his sentence, he looked understanding. No murder weapon, no motive. No one looked into it further after he was sentenced. The jury took less than an hour to deliberate. For 15 years, no one tried to find out exactly what happened to Teresa Romero. Why would they? They had a conviction, right? It's just, I struggled to find the words. There are some things that don't seem to add up. I know, he stated simply, with a shrug of his shoulders. Listen to me, Manny. I watched his expression closely, making sure that I didn't overstep a boundary by calling him by his first name. If you didn't kill your wife, we need to know. If you did, I pressed my lips into a taut line. Why can't we figure out how? It doesn't matter anymore. It's over. His words were curt, with emphasis placed on the last word. Yes, it does. I know my face showed my bewilderment. Her family deserves answers. They were your family too. Remember? Romero said nothing. his eyes glued to the concrete floor. I readjusted myself in my seat, aiming to try a new approach. Maybe if I hint at his innocence, he'll be more open. If you didn't do it, I can help. We can try to get you out. No. His voice was loud, echoing off the walls. He swallowed, taking a shallow breath. No. He repeated, quieter, calmer. I am exactly where I belong. Why do you belong here? I matched my tone to his. Because my wife is dead. Sorrow. But not just sorrow. Pain. Even with every syllable of his words drenched in emotion. It lacked one. Guilt. Do you miss her? I surprised even myself by asking. A hint of a smile played at the corner of his lips. Not a menacing smile, but one remembering a time long gone. One of reminiscence. Every day. There was no murder weapon found. No motive. No one could figure out why you'd want Teresa dead. You never fled the scene. You had days to leave. Why didn't you? Guess I had nowhere to go. You could have gone anywhere. I knew my patience was beginning to wear thinner. Why didn't you leave? What happened to her? No response. Just another empty silence. Please. I leaned in closer. Please tell me what happened to her. Exactly 1 week ago I sat at my computer, researching this case. I had found Teresa's account on a community website that I won't name here. She had detailed her fear, her experiences as she began seeing someone who looked exactly like her. December 10th, 2007. It looks like me, but it doesn't at the same time. It's like I took a photograph of myself and edited my features just a little bit. Like it wants to look like me but can't get it right. I see her in mirrors. In the corner of my eye. In the distance. She used to be far enough away that I could block her out and pretend she's not there. Now, she is closer. Her mouth is always wide open. Like she is screaming but no sound comes out. Her eyes are bloodshot. She looks terrified. December 18th, 2007. I've tried to tell my husband. He doesn't believe me. Nobody believes me. I point directly to her. She is 20 feet away but no one can ever see her. Every day she gets closer and closer. And there is a pit in my stomach that makes me nauseous. Am I losing my mind? What am I supposed to do? Is she going to hurt me? Does anyone else know what I'm talking about? Please. January 11th, 2008. Fucking antipsychotics. That is his answer to everything. I'm not crazy. And the pills don't help. I can't understand why no one will listen to me. I don't know what I did to deserve this. I've always been a good person. I do everything right. Why is she always here? Why is she always staring at me? She doesn't talk to me. I've tried talking to her. I've screamed at her. January 14th, 2008. She is so close now that I can smell her. She smells like death. I was a CNA once. I've smelt a dead person before. It's kind of a sweet, rotten smell. That's what she smells like. Do I smell like that? She looks just like me now. Do I have those dark circles under my eyes? Are my lips that cracked? Is my skin gray? January 24th, 2008. She is like a shadow now. That's how close she stays to me. I've given up on Manny. He will never listen to me. But I'll keep taking these pills if that makes him like he's doing something. I told him that I'm going to die. She is going to kill me. And he doesn't believe me. He doesn't believe me. February 5th, 2008. He doesn't believe me. February 10th, 2008. She makes a sound now. A low, crackling moan. She's so close. I can hear her directly in my ear. I try not to look at her. But she's always in my sight. She never leaves. Maybe it's because I haven't slept or eaten, but I know my time is coming to an end. I can feel it. There is nothing I can do. February 12th, 2008. Her mouth is still wide open. But now, it looks like she's smiling. Please, I repeated. I could almost see Romero shutting down. You're not guilty of killing her, are you? Romero clenched his jaw again but did not look at me. You're guilty of not listening to her. And that's why she's dead. Finally, his eyes met mine. From the black, I could see a hint of understanding. So, you've read the posts. It wasn't a question. I nodded, silently. I'm sorry. Teresa wasn't right. In the head, I took a deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs entirely, until they burned, then let it out slowly. What? I paused. Happened to her? Mr. Branham, a soft female voice called, jerking my attention away from Romero. Time's up. We need to take him back. You can come back next week. I nodded, trying to regain my composure. I did my best to ignore the figure standing behind her. A figure that looks like me, but doesn't at the same time. I left the prison feeling far more defeated than when I arrived. I've had a harsh, dreadful feeling sitting like concrete in the pit of my stomach since I read Teresa's posts. At first, I couldn't even tell that it was supposed to look like me. Apparently, it's hard to recognize ourselves when we're not looking at a picture or our reflection. It's an eerie feeling, knowing that whatever this is, looks familiar. And at the same time, it looks so foreign. It stays close to me, just close enough that I can feel its presence. It's always staring, but its gaze is unsettling, unnatural. People walk right past it, blissfully blind. I have investigated murders for the better part of a decade. My mind is not an easy one to break. Level-headed, analytic, calm. All traits you need in order to be successful in this line of work. I don't believe in paranormal bullshit, demonic or otherwise. So, you could say it came as a shock when I couldn't fight off this uneasy wave of fear and dread at the sight of this thing. A thing. Because I don't know what else to call it. As much as my instinct tries to persuade me differently, I know that this thing isn't human. Humans don't stand amongst a crowd, unmoving, without a hint of acknowledgement. Nobody looks twice. Nobody makes an effort to interact. No human stands for hours on end. Mouth agape, not blinking. No rise and fall of the chest, no breathing. It seems that its sole purpose is to stand there and stare at me until I break down into a state of perpetual psychosis. Honestly, I would prefer that over what happened to Teresa. Imagine a corpse, one still rigid with rigor mortis. Now, imagine that corpse standing, head tilted just slightly to the right. A corpse with its eyes pinned wide open, red tinged all around the edges, and its mouth, its jaw unhinged and open wider than what should be possible. Now imagine that corpse following you around, never leaving you, never letting you out of its sight. That kind of shit wears heavy on a person. It wasn't with pride that I took to Google for answers. It was a last resort. Maybe someone has dealt with this before? Maybe there's something I can do? So, I stumbled across Teresa's posts. Initially, my interest was piqued, but I had reservations. You simply can't believe everything you read on the internet. While her story seemed to eat away at that nagging weight in my stomach, it didn't become real until I searched her name. Then, it felt like the world around me slowed. My heartbeat thudded angrily in my ears. My breath hitched somewhere between my lungs and mouth. And the pressure on my chest. Fuck, was that pressure intense? I had peered over to my darkened kitchen, at the figure standing silently beside the empty table, and blinked back tears, not because I was afraid of dying, but because I was afraid of how long I would have to suffer like this. Suffer knowing how it would end. Meeting with Romero today was my last-ditch effort to find out how to save myself. With that option ripped away, defeat mixed itself into despair. It won't be long now. He's so close to me. I can reach out and touch him. I imagine he feels cold and hollow. I used to try and focus on the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. Tachycardic but steady, human. Now, all I can hear is a low, wicked groan, and as I sit in my desk chair, it leans over me, like it's frothing to take me at any moment. It feels eager, like it's been starved for years, and it's finally about to feast. I imagine it must be ready, because even though I try not to look directly at it, I can still see its gaping mouth begin to turn upwards into a smile. Story. I was in prison for 15 years. There was a skinwalker in there with us. A little background first. I was serving a 15-year sentence in a penitentiary in southern Arizona. What I was in there for isn't important. During my stay there were countless things that happened that no one could explain, and even more that no one wanted to know more about. It all started with a prison legend. Supposedly, years ago something awful and unexplainable happened in the prison. Every morning we'd be woken up and expected to stand near the front of our cells while guards visually confirmed we were present and accounted for. Apparently about a year before I got sent there, the most brutal and unexplainable thing happened during one of these routines. A man who had a cell to himself looked very off during this check. When a guard pulled over another guard to help him check it out, they found it wasn't actually the prisoner they were expecting at all. It was a totally different man. This man was wearing the skin of the other man over him, loosely fitting, draped over him, apparently looked like a real monster. The scariest things were though, was the guy wearing the skin was not an inmate. They had no idea how he even got into prison, let alone a cell. What's worse is that they couldn't even figure out who the hell he was. He wasn't documented anywhere. And what's worse than that, they never even found the body of the man of the skin he was wearing. Pretty grisly stuff, I know, and I realize that's not the go-to definition of a skinwalker. But that's what the prison called him. The skinwalker. Didn't help that the guy never talked apparently. Anyway, that's what started the whole skinwalker superstition around the yard. Apparently the guy got shipped to a different spot about a month after it happened. And just about everyone in Genpop felt all the better for it. I heard about the story on the second day of my stay. Hell of a story to hear to place in your home for the foreseeable future. Now onto the real shit though. Sure, that guy was the skinwalker. But all he did in the long run was get an old lifer Navajo inmate to tell everyone about actual skinwalkers. It seemed like a lot of the prison culture actually revolved around them. Now, apparently, skinwalkers are tricky to point out on the spot, but if you manage to survive around one for more than a minute or two, almost everyone can tell the mannerisms are all off. They can mimic human speech but not replicate it. They twitch manically. They have an unnatural gait while walking. But apparently they got better with experience. The old Navajo guy, his name was Carl, said that he was sure there was an actual one among the prisoners, slowly picking us off over the years. He called it the Grandmaster Skinwalker at one point. Apparently he thought it had human mannerisms down so well that you might not even be able to tell if it was your cellmate for a day or two. It had to be good, he posited one night. He would expect a skinwalker to jump at any opportunity for a kill. But this one realized it had a revolving door of people to kill coming to it, and masterfully bided its time. As Carl thought, for years, a lot of guys found humor in it. A lot more were really on edge about it. Every once in a while in prison, people snap. Sometimes you'll find your cellmate swinging in front of your bunk, strung up around the neck by his pant leg. Sometimes you just can't take it anymore. But in our yard, people tended to snap in a very special way. It wouldn't be an outburst at dinner, or a silent suicide in the night. Guys would just stop talking, hunch over and shuffle around. Any friendships they had would be mostly out the window. They would turn into a loner during rec time. They would let their hair hang in front of their face. No one liked to talk about it. Like if they did, it would happen to them next. I felt the same way. I didn't know if it was a skinwalker, or just people going crazy. But I didn't want to find out. It wasn't clockwork or anything. But every time someone snapped in this way, it wasn't more than a couple weeks before they were shipped off, or transferred, to God knows where without anyone else knowing beforehand. Then there was the nighttime occurrences. Short, loud bursts of sound echoed through my cell block during all hours of the night on a regular basis. It sounded like a mix between a pig's dying squeals and nails on a chalkboard. Just another thing no one liked to talk about. Even scarier were the shadows and footsteps. The block was dimly illuminated in the night by a few lights hanging from the ceiling outside the cells. I myself saw shadows flit across my walls on a regular occasion. When there were definitely no guards near my cell. One time near the end of my sentence, I woke up, looked at my back wall and found a perfect silhouette of a person standing there. But when I looked, my bunkmate was asleep, and no one was outside my cell. And the footsteps. Everyone hated the fucking footsteps. They were the scariest part. In the night, sometimes, more rarely than the shadows, you would hear ungodly fast footsteps. They sounded like wet feet slapping on tile floor. Whatever caused them would fly from one end of the block to the other in a dead sprint. Whatever it was inhumanely fast. If you happened to be awake before it started, by the time you heard the footsteps on one side of your cell and whipped your head around to see the thing run by, it sounded like it was 3 cells past you. Everyone hated the footsteps. I agreed. I thought they were the worst. I was released from that place about a month ago, and I have more stories than I can count. I swear it was nearly my turn. About a week before I was discharged, my cellmate, and a good friend of mine, snapped. In the same kinda way. I didn't sleep for an entire week. Well, I did sleep, of course, but never for more than a few minutes at a time. Never turned my back on the guy. The scariest thing? I woke up one night to him somehow snaking his body through the bars of our cell. For reference, I couldn't get anything past my shoulder through them. The worst part, though, he was coming back into our cell. On the day of my release, I didn't say a word to him. Just left. He seemed fine with it. So was I. I had made it through 15 years of prison fights, gang disputes, and for all I know, skinwalker abductions. I left through the front gates, a free man. As I walked along the fence for the rec yard, I spotted my cellmate, standing off on his own, like he had for the last week or so. I shook my head, not even really sure if it was him anymore. I took one last look over the yard, this time from the other side of the fence. I wish I hadn't. There, standing off on his own, on the other side of the yard, was Carl, slouched over, eyeing the other inmates, and twitching manically. Story. There's a death row inmate who we've executed over a dozen times. He won't stay dead. We killed Joseph Glass for the first time on August 18, 1999. I knew he was a strange case since day one. Never seen a guy so happy to die before. It was like we were doing him a favor. He refused the automatic appeal. He refused to be seen by a chaplain. He just wanted it over with. It had only taken a little over a year, and it was already time for him to make his appointment with God. He freaked me out, just passing by his cell. He was like our very own Hannibal Lecter. The way he just stood there in the back of his cell like he'd been waiting for you. The lights always burned out in any cell he was in, and maintenance had gotten tired of fixing them. Not that he seemed to mind in the slightest. The darkness seemed to swallow his top half, and all I could see were the whites of his beady little eyes poking out of all that black. Billy drummed his baton against the bars. Up and at him. Cowpoke, he called in that mocking tone. Time finally come for you to pay what you owe. You sick son of a... Billy. Warden Taft silenced him with a word. If you can't act like a professional, you're going to have to sit this one out. Billy paused, and licked his chapped lips. Nah, he muttered. This a show I can't miss. Glass seemed to tick Billy off more than any prisoner before him. He liked him to at least pretend to feel sorry for what they've done, or act scared of what's coming to him. This one didn't even have the common decency to shed a tear. He was as stone-faced as a statue, even while being marched to the chair. Billy liked to joke sometimes that we ought to take the guy out back with some car batteries and really put the fear of God into him. Get him to cut out that stoic act. I think he was only half joking. After what this guy did to those girls, well, Billy has a daughter, so I guess it struck a chord. We all watched him fry. The warden, his closest men, the thin-faced man representing the Commissioner of Corrections, the prison physician, the families of those poor girls. It couldn't have gone more by the book. Only oddity I'd noticed at the time was that the stench of death never quite left the clothes I'd worn that day. And then the next morning, we came into work to see the whites of those beady little eyes staring at us from the darkness again. Good morning, sirs, he said, just as he did every morning, in that airy, hoarse little voice. I'll admit it, I dropped everything I was carrying, stumbled back, stammered like a confused child. Hell, I almost screamed. You're not, why you're supposed to be? I don't know what you mean. Sir. He leaned in like he was trying to stare a hole through my chest. His tone almost sounded disappointed. You never came for me. You promised me that yesterday would be the end. Sir. But you never came. I waited all night long. Why did you lie to me? Me and Taft looked at each other. We both had the exact same question on our minds. If Glass was still alive, who the hell did we roll into the morgue last night? Jesus Christ. Taft gagged when he pulled back the cadaver cover. Stumbling away. It's Billy. I looked. I know I shouldn't have. But I couldn't help it. And I'll be forever haunted by the sight of my friend lying there on his back. Mouth agape and cloudy eyes staring into the ceiling. Open wide as if he'd spent his last moments in a state of terror. The public never found out what happened. The cover-up story was that poor Billy had been taken by cardiac arrest. Internally, it was the scandal to end all scandals. Worst case of incompetence and negligence in history. They called it. They brought the hammer down on anyone even tangentially involved. Me and Taft were out on our ears. And they would have prosecuted us too. But that would have required admitting it ever happened. But I just could never wrap my head around it. Of those dozens of witnesses, not a single person noticed we were strapping a guard to the chair. Not an inmate? It was impossible to the point of absurdity. Glass had been the man in that chair. I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. Some months later, I noticed power flickering off all over the city one evening. It was brief, so I thought nothing of it, at least until I got a call from a familiar number the very next morning. I understand you were one of the staff who regularly worked with one Joseph Glass. We would like to consult with you about an evolving situation. Oh, at 7 p.m. yesterday, we attempted the execution of Joseph Glass for the second time. There was a long pause. And when the voice returned, the professionalism had melted away, replaced with a baffled anxiety. And, well, it didn't work. I blinked. It didn't, what? There came a long sigh. Perhaps it'd be best if you saw for yourself. And just like that, me and Taft had our jobs back. Officially, Joseph Glass had been successfully executed on August 18, 1999. Unofficially, they'd tried again 6 months later, just to tie up loose ends. This time, he hadn't even had the courtesy to pretend to die. He just sat there on the chair, motionless and unaffected, while the CO who'd flipped the switch suddenly seized up and began to convulse. Screaming and gnashing and wailing as electricity seared him beneath his skin, clawing at his chest until his eyes popped in his skull and rolled down his face like melted candle wax. All around him, lights flickering, machines bursting from pressure, electrical panels vomiting arcs of static. It was a mess. The feds were crawling all over this case now. From a department I've never heard of. Something about investigating preternatural activity. They told me Glass was refusing to speak with anybody but the co's who'd once cared for him. Being walked into that interrogation room almost made me feel like I myself was a convict being marched to his execution. Glass was staring at me when I walked in, like he'd been sat there, motionless, waiting for me. I expected nothing less. I took a shuddering breath as I sat across from him. I'd sat across from serial killers and psychos before and showed no hint of fear. But how could I not? Now, sitting across from a man who can kill people without touching them. Glass. Officer Mendez. His tone betrayed no emotion. I had thought you'd abandoned me. I winced. No, Glass. I'd just been temporarily relieved. It's good to see you again. Would you like a glass of water? I offered it to him. He didn't even look at it. His eyes just bored into mine. Relentless. I'm here to ask you a few questions. Silence. Okay. Glass. I need to know how you killed Billy and Kramer. I didn't, he replied. It did. The thing standing behind you. I didn't bother to turn around. I had enough experience with prisoners trying to trick me into looking the other way while they pulled off some half-baked escape plan. Glass. Please, let's take this seriously, I replied. I've always treated you with respect. Haven't I? You've never had any problems with me. Actually, I do. I have a problem with all of you. Oh? You here all believe that death is a punishment. There was the first hint of emotion I'd ever heard in his voice. It's not. It's freedom, the only freedom. You promised me that gift. You promised me you'd let me die. You've given it to so many other prisoners, while leaving me behind. With all of your machines and your science and your knowledge, surely you can find a way. If anyone. My throat felt suddenly dry. I had to take a sip of the water myself, and hoped it would quell my burning nerves. We're trying our best. Glass. But you have to work with us. It may help if you told us what exactly is preventing us from executing you? He moved for the first time, leaning in, so slow as to be almost imperceptible. It won't let me die. And that's when I felt a hand settle on my shoulder from behind. Everything stopped. My lungs stopped inflating. I swear, my heart stopped beating, and my blood froze in place in my veins. And it all felt so cold. I could see the hand in the corner of my eyes, long and veiny and black. I could feel the breath on the back of my neck. I'd once mocked the way deers froze in headlights. Now I understood. I couldn't move. I couldn't blink. I couldn't think. I couldn't even take a single breath, even as my lungs began to cry out for air, and my vision blurred, and my thoughts melded together. All I could see was Joseph's eyes staring into mine, those infinite fathoms of darkness, that Stygian sea that swirled and stormed and thundered in the blackness of his iris, and the eyes of things waiting a million leagues below the waters. And I would have suffocated there, too terrified to even breathe, if those agents in black had not called off the interrogation then and come storming into the room. Later, they showed me the tapes from the security camera. There'd been nothing behind me, nothing placing its thin hand upon my shoulder, nothing at all. On May 7, 2001, Glass was set to be executed for the third time, via hanging. Or so I heard, in some government black site somewhere, far from prying eyes. While it was set to happen, me and Taft were sharing glasses of scotch in his office, nominally to celebrate, really, because we were scared. Taft always struck me as young at heart despite his years. But this was the first time the warden had ever looked truly, properly old. He watched the yard below as he had a drink. Did I ever tell you why I chose this line of work? Mendez? I shook my head, and he sighed. Back in 63, they found a woman's body in the back seat of a burnt-out car. In some state park near my neighborhood, a prostitute, one of her Johns, had chopped her up, burned all the evidence, and you know what got me? Mendez? Nobody cared. Nobody bothered to investigate. Who will notice one less hooker on the corner of 5th Avenue? Right? It didn't sit right with me. The way I see it, Mendez, every life matters, even the ones we try and cast aside. Everybody's got people who love them, and childhood memories, and all that. Everybody deserves justice, no matter who they were. He set down his glass and looked me in the eyes. So I joined the force. Got the case reopened, found the guy, and I watched him fry. And I like to imagine she was there watching, too, as he burned. There was a tense moment, and then a chuckle. Course, after that bullet to the hip in 71, I couldn't walk the beat anymore. But I've been just as happy here. Watching justice be served, it makes me feel like there's some kind of karmic order to the world. Good deeds and bad deeds get repaid in kind. It was clear there was something lurking beneath his words. Some unspoken thesis. Eventually, with old, wrinkled, tired eyes, he said it. I've thought about it. And, if Glass doesn't die tonight, I'm finally going to retire. Mendez, he confessed, after what he did to those girls. What kind of order can there be in a world where a monster like that is just beyond justice? I was shocked. Warden Taft always struck me as an unmoving fixture. What would we do without him? He'll die. Sir, I promised. It'll work this time. It has to. But he seemed deeply uncertain. With one last shuddering drink, he leaned forward. His eyes. He stared at my expression, as if desperate for me to understand, for me to know. Those things, in his eyes. Haven't you seen them? And at that moment, Taft was yanked up out of his chair. It was so sudden, so inexplicable, I could barely register what I was witnessing. Some unseen force lifted him 2 or 3 feet above the ground. Dangling him there, he choked, coughed and sputtered, desperate to gasp down air which would not come, and clawed at something around his neck which I could not see. He was hanging, I realized, and with wide, horrified eyes, the same as Billy's had been. He silently begged me for help. I sprang from my chair and wrapped my arms around his dangling legs. At first I tried to pull him down to the floor, but I realized it was only tightening the invisible noose around his neck. Then I tried lifting him as high as I could, which gave him some relief. But not much. Tears rolled down his face as it swelled and turned blue. And even though I could not see the noose, I could see the bruised purple skin where it had squeezed around his neck. All the while, I screamed myself hoarse. Help! Somebody! Please! Jesus Christ! We need help in here. But nobody came. And all of a sudden, some unseen force seemed to sweep my feet out from under me. I dropped like a bag of bricks. But I was so startled I maintained my grip around the warden's legs. I fell and yanked him down with me, and his body suddenly jolted with a sickening crack. It took me a while to manage the courage to look up at him. His neck had been stretched far too long, and his head was bent to the side at almost a 90-degree angle. Eyes wide, round and bloated tongue hanging from dry lips. And then whatever force had suspended him disappeared, and his body fell upon me while I screamed and screamed. I came bursting from his office to find my coworkers casually chatting and working just outside. Somehow, despite all my screaming and begging while Taft was dying, none of them had heard a thing. I took a page from Taft. I wanted out. We were dealing with something unholy here. Something whose tendrils could reach any distance. And my life, who knows? Maybe even my soul, was at hazard. But the agents in the sharp suits made one thing clear: if I refused to cooperate, well, I would make the perfect scapegoat for the murder of Warden Taft. I was marched into the interrogation room to find a Joseph Glass that had abandoned all pretense of humanity. His eyes had darkened to a pure black. Or perhaps he had no eyes at all, only windows into some place of outer darkness. I was shaking like a leaf as I sat in front of him, feeling more like a prisoner than he was. Mr. Glass. No reply. I shuddered, trying to focus on my little piece of paper to distract myself from the blackness of his eyes. I have some questions I'm supposed to ask you. Is that okay? Silence. I take a deep breath. How old are you? Glass? I thought it was just one of those basic questions. Conversation starters. Really, I couldn't have prepared myself for his answer. I am old, child. His voice was nothing like I remembered. It was deep and low and rumbling, like there were multiple people speaking in unison, and all were equally ancient, older than you could possibly know, older than this nation, and older even than the empire that once bore it. I had to fight the basic animal instinct to flee. Focus on the questions. I thought, why did you do what you did to those girls? Just so I could feel something again. He whispered, anything. Did you not feel the slightest bit of guilt? Remorse? You ask that of me? Me, who has watched empires rise and fall. He almost sounded amused. Does time feel remorse? For time has killed far more than I. But mankind is like the Hydra. All I've killed will be replaced by, essentially, identical stock, and in greater numbers. And then they will die and be replaced. And so the cycle will continue forever. Did you expect me to pity them for being given the death I myself covet? Only the dead are given leave of the cycle. It is a blessing. And suddenly, he stood from his chair, as if he'd never been restrained at all. A blessing you promised me, Officer Mendez. I stared up at him in disbelief. What? How did you? But I couldn't even stammer a sentence out before he was upon me, crawling over the table with the eerie grace of a spider. These were no longer the imperceptible hints of emotions I'd come to expect. It was like a switch had been flipped. Tears streamed down his cheeks, snarling with genuine rage, hurt, betrayal, and beneath those black seas in his eyes, all the things that haunted the fathoms below were rising to the surface. You owe me a death. Make good on your word. Pay your debt. I cried out and recoiled from his every touch with disgust. But he was stronger than he looked. I couldn't worm my way out of his impossible grip. I won't. Get off of me, you sick bastard. Do it. Pay me what you owe. It was like 1,000 different voices screaming in my ear. Straining and weeping, I locked my hands around his neck and pressed my thumbs against his throat, trying to strangle him, but instead, I could just feel that grip upon my own neck, squeezing the life out of myself as my lungs burned for air. Yet I kept pressing harder and harder, as if hoping I might somehow break through whatever unholy force was protecting him. And then those terrible hands grasped my shoulders again, and I was paralyzed by a terror that could be called nothing but ancient and primal. Like the thing standing behind me was the same force that had kept my ancestors huddled terrified in their caves 100,000 years ago. And every one of those voices was crying out to me through my very blood. And it pulled me from my chair, threw me as though I were weightless, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up in the infirmary. Once more. None of this was captured on the security camera. In the footage, I just enter the room and have a seat with strange, almost robotic movements, and then the both of us just sit there, staring at each other, without speaking, without moving, without blinking, for an hour. After this, Joseph Glass entered a catatonic state, and from then on refused to converse with even me. Now that my usefulness had ended, the agents discarded me like yesterday's trash. Don't even seem to care if I tell anybody. Who would believe me? I thought I'd gotten lucky. That my nightmare was over. I couldn't have been more wrong. Go sorting through any public records, and you won't find a single mention of the name Joseph Glass. They've squirreled him away in that off-the-books black site and scrubbed away every other trace of him. I'd say he'd been unpersoned, if indeed he could ever be called a person at all. But they're still trying every execution method in the book. I don't know quite why. Maybe it's for research. I'm sure the US military would love to find the secret to making its men as unkillable as Glass. And besides, they're not the ones who have to deal with the consequences. On June 3, 2005, they tried a firing squad. I know this because me and my wife were out on our second honeymoon, slow dancing by the lake at night to our favorite song. When I felt a wetness against my chest, I looked down to see her eyes as gray and dull as foggy glass, and her chest shredded to Swiss cheese by rounds that made no sound. On December 23, 2012, they tried lethal injection. That was the day they found my son's car wrapped around a tree, and baffled coroners discovered that he was dead before the accident even occurred. His bloodstream polluted with pavilon and potassium chloride. It's been years since I've isolated myself from everyone I knew, hermiting away in this cabin out in the middle of nowhere. And yet the stench of death still follows me. Just a couple years ago, I found a news report mentioning my nephew. Apparently, he'd been found completely exsanguinated, his veins emptied utterly despite no signs of a struggle. God knows what kind of arcane methods of execution they're trying by now. He's not going to let me walk away from this, not while I still owe him a debt. But I've been doing some research, too. Research into those untold legions of things I witnessed staring up from that blackened sea in Glass's eyes. I've learned things men were not meant to know. Practiced rites, assembled tools, ingredients, and I think I know where they're keeping him. Even though they blindfolded me, I counted the second between every turn on our way to the black site. And I've since spent weeks watching the place, cataloging every entry point. Maybe I'm slipping into madness. Or maybe I've truly found the way to put an end to the horror. To finally give this monster the justice that Taft would have wanted for him. Joseph Glass had been right about one single thing. I have to pay what I owe, even if it kills me. Mysteries are everywhere, and some may be closer than you think. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next mystery. See you in the next story.